This is GARIS, Masculist, MGTOW flyers. That is 2 3-page essays on the themes of masculism and MGTOW. Written and read aloud by Prof. Dr. Hugo de GARIS. This is flyer number 153, entitled My Growing... Oh, just a minute, sorry. MGTOW's Biggest Mistake. Description. This flyer claims that MGTOWs should be a lot more political by using their strongest argument, that is, that if society and the gender politicians do not menfair, that's the verb, the gender laws and society in general, then the MGTOW/masculists will continue to boycott paternity and wipe out whole populations. The population annihilation argument. Now for the flyer itself. MGTOW's biggest mistake. The main difference between the MGTOWs and the masculists is that the MGTOWs are apolitical, whereas the masculists are very political. The MGTOWs are politically passive because they reason that our culture is so genocentric and so indifferent to men's gender plight that there is no persuading it to listen to men's gender issues. So MGTOWs do the only thing that is available to them, in their view, and that is to just walk away, abandoning the culture and going their own way. MGTOW sages, that is intellectuals, sages, 2 syllables, intellectuals, 5 syllables, reinforce this commonly held MGTOW attitude by saying that any political attempt by MGTOWs to persuade the gender politicians to menfair the gender laws, for example regarding divorce, the para, that's paternity rejection right, etc., would be a total waste of time and effort because women have the vote and outnumber men. So the gender politicians, being politicians and focusing only on the next election cycle and not the longer term, will not choose to give men what men want, because that would conflict with what most women want. For example, continuing the massively unjust divorce laws against men that are so strongly biased in women's favour, keeping a ban against the para, etc. So women, the majority of the voters, would vote them out if they listen to what the MGTOW/masculists have to say. On the surface, this sounds like a pretty plausible argument and is widely accepted amongst MGTOWs, but in my view it is badly wrong-headed because it overlooks the most powerful argument that the MGTOW/masculists have, namely the population annihilation argument. That is, if the genocidally criminal gender politicians do not menfair the gender laws, then the MGTOW/masculists will continue to boycott marriage and particularly fatherhood and thus wipe out the population. This population annihilation argument of the masculists/MGTOWs is their trump card. It is incredibly powerful and should be used against the gender politicians and pushed on the media and society in general. Japan has had its herbivore men problem for about a decade longer than there have been MGTOWs in any number in the US. So the population crash in Japan has been going longer, to the point that Japan is now starting to see its population decline. At its peak it was 128 million. It's now 127 million. That is, it's lost 1 million in just a few years. Demographers calculate that in a few decades, once the baby boomers have died off, the Japanese population will have fallen by 1/3. The current birth rate in Japan is only 1.4 children per woman, compared to the replacement rate of 2.1. So if this trend continues, Japan is doomed. The Japanese government is so concerned about this problem that they have appointed a minister, that is a cabinet-level politician of population, whose job it is, amongst other things, to try to persuade the herbivore men to be fathers. So far this minister has not succeeded because he's taken a traditional approach by trying to shame young Japanese men to man up. Young Japanese men, under 35, look at the lifestyle of their fathers and are repelled. Japanese salarymen, husband salarymen, work 11-hour days, 3-hour commute times on average. They hand over their paychecks to their fluffy wives, who give them a small allowance and then spend it on the house, the kids, and themselves. In Japan, the husbands overwork and the wives play tennis. Young Japanese men are rebelling against this traditional salaryman man-slave role to women and are going MGTOW, or herbivore in Japanese terms. If herbivore just means grass eaters, so they're the opposite of carnivores, who are men who are hungry and go hunting sex from women. If Japanese herbivores had more imagination and were more politically savvy, they could go to the Minister of Population and tell him, quote, "Look, if you don't fundamentally reform the gender roles in Japan, Japan is going to wipe itself out through lack of births. We herbivores reject the traditional salaryman man-slave role because we don't want to be miserable like our fathers. We want to enjoy life and not be man-slaves to fluffy parasites. You need to systematically reform the gender laws, for example in divorce, bring in the para, etc. There's so much to do. You'll need to push for young women to become FIPs, financially independent persons. So that means that they'll have to study FIP majors at high school. You'll need to make calculus compulsory in 12th grade, so women aren't excluded from STEM, science, tech, engineering, math, departments at university. So that they end up being poorly paid fluffies in their 30s, who then look around for some manslave to parasite upon, to have him pay for her to live in a middle-class apartment and raise her 1.4 kids. You'll need to reform the education system to push young women to be FIPs, or they'll be punished by not getting a man. You'll need to change the gender norms and put moral pressure on women to be FIPs. Be FIP or be manless. You will need to encourage the journalists to push the ideas of men's lib, so that parents and teachers absorb these ideas and then help pressurize young women to get a career-competent, career-responsible education and not take the lazy, soft option at high school, that is non-math, non-sciences, expecting her to be able to parasite on some manslave later in her life. You need to change the mentality in Japan that to be a fluffy is to be immoral, parasitic and manslaving. Herbivores punish such women by having nothing to do with them, not even sexing them. These fluffy women are being punished for expecting to be able to parasite off the money of a man. Now, with a little bit of thought, you know you have no choice but to menfair society and the gender laws, because you know that if you don't, then the herbivores are just going to give you more of the same, more headache, as the Japanese population continues to crash. You've probably seen the demographic trends. In a mere few decades, the baby boomers will have died off, and the Japanese population will have fallen to about 80 million. That is about 2/3 of its current figure. In a further few decades, it'll be down to 50 million. In a century, Japan will be effectively no more, because there won't be any Japanese left. If you want the herbivores to stop annihilating the population by refusing paternity, you have to make being a father an attractive proposition for men. In other words, you will have to fundamentally restructure Japanese society by making women FIPs, by menfairing the gender laws and changing society's expectations of the gender roles. If you don't, you'll be seen as a genocidal criminal who was indirectly responsible for the annihilation of the Japanese population. As the population continues to crash, millions of Japanese will become alarmed and start taking matters into their own hands. You'll then risk being assassinated because people will argue that desperate times call for desperate measures. You may be seen as a criminal in not doing what needs to be done to persuade men to be fathers again. New section. The above was the Japanese situation. The West is not far behind. Both the US and Japan are seeing their young men, that is less than 35, rejecting fatherhood at a large majority rate. About 70% of young men in both countries refuse to marry and refuse to be fathers, due largely to the toxicity of the divorce courts and hence marriage. The major difference between the US and Japan on this score is that the paternity rejection has been going on about a decade longer in Japan than in the US. So the Japanese politicians have had more time to become conscious of the population annihilation problem than US politicians. But the US politicians will catch up and fast. From the above, MGTOWs in the US should be able to see that they have potentially a very powerful ideological tool that they can use to persuade the gender politicians in the US to menfair the gender laws and to menfair society in general. Therefore, MGTOWs should become a lot more political, using the population annihilation argument as their primary weapon, threatening the gender politicians with it. That if they don't menfair society and the gender laws, then the MGTOW/masculists will simply continue to wipe out whole populations. I'm currently waiting to see a half-hour interview of me on the issues of species dominance, that is, whether humanity should build artilects, that's artificial intellects, that's my word by the way, godlike massively intelligent machines, on RT, that's Russia Today, on the Sophie Co show. She told me that her show will get 1 billion views with a B. That didn't happen. Once it's up, I will contact her again, suggesting she might be interested in doing another show, but this time with the theme being on MGTOW/masculism and the threat of population annihilation, the biggest issue of our times, because what is more important to humanity than its very survival? If she likes the idea, then 1 billion views, skeptical, on the issue of MGTOWs/masculists, wiping out whole populations, would be a very political act, and spread the ideas to, well, 1 billion. Well, probably more like 1 million. Anyway, that would be a wonderful kickstart to the politicization of MGTOW, or a boost to masculism. I know from reading comments on the MGTOW YouTube sites that a portion of the MGTOWs want to see the MGTOW movement be more political, more active in trying to persuade the gender politicians and society to be more menfair. Hopefully, with a greater level of consciousness of the enormous power of the population annihilation argument, more MGTOWs will get off their apolitical asses and start helping fellow men to free themselves from gender role oppression, especially from manslavery by bloody fluffies. Cheers. Prof. Dr. Hugo de GARIS. Email profhugodegaris@yahoo.com. Website profhugodegaris.wordpress.com. YouTube channel name de GARIS Masculist MGTOW Flyers.